We all have good days and bad days. We all feel anxious sometimes, or sad, or just off. That's totally normal. It's just part of being human. But is there a line, a point where those everyday feelings cross over into something more, where a bad mood becomes an actual clinical disorder? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. This really is the big question, isn't it? What's the real difference between feeling sad for a week and having clinical depression, or between worrying about a test and having an anxiety disorder? To get to the bottom of it, we have to look at how the experts draw that line. So let's dive right in. So, where do we even begin? Well, it turns out it's not just about how a person feels. To get a real objective answer, we have to go straight to the source, the official blueprint, you could say, the clinical rulebook that psychologists and psychiatrists use to make these diagnoses. Okay, let's start with the foundation. What is the actual clinical definition of a mental disorder? If we can really understand this one sentence, everything else is going to click into place. Wow. Okay, I know that is a mouthful, but let's translate it. Clinically significant disturbance basically just means it's a big enough problem to notice and to cause real trouble. And that word dysfunction, that's key. It means something in the system isn't working the way it's supposed to. Think of it like a software glitch in your brain's operating system that affects how you think, feel, or act. It's not just a passing mood, it's a persistent underlying issue. And here's a really, really important point. A disorder isn't just about being quirky or different from the crowd. It's not about having a conflict with society's expectations. The problem has to come from a dysfunction inside the person, and it has to cause a genuine, meaningful disruption to their life. All right, that big definition is still a lot to chew on, so let's break it down into three much simpler pieces. If you can get your head around these three ideas, you'll pretty much have the whole picture. First up, we have distress. This is the part we're probably all most familiar with, that internal, emotional pain. A perfect example is severe depression, right? That deep feeling of sadness and hopelessness is a central feature. It's that personal, subjective suffering. But, and this is a huge but, distress can't be the only thing we look at. Why? Well, think about certain conditions, like antisocial personality disorder. The person with the disorder might not feel much personal distress at all, but they might be causing immense suffering to their family, friends, and society. So clearly, we're missing another piece of the puzzle. And that brings us to the second, and you could argue the most important component, impairment. This is the real-world test. For something to be classified as a disorder, it can't just be an internal feeling. It has to actually get in the way of a person's life in a major way, messing with their work, their relationships, or just their basic ability to get through the day. And this slide lays out some perfect examples of what that impairment can look like. For a student with severe ADHD, it might be academic impairment. They simply can't focus in class no matter how hard they try. For someone else, it might mean they can't seem to hold down a job, or all their friendships fall apart. It's a real, tangible impact on their ability to live their life. Okay, so we've got distress and we've got impairment. But there is a third, absolutely critical lens we have to look through, and that's culture. Because what's considered abnormal in one part of the world might be completely normal in another. This is such a powerful example, isn't it? In a typical Western context, hearing the voice of a loved one who's passed away could be seen as a serious red flag for psychosis. But in other cultural traditions, it can be a totally normal and accepted part of grieving or a spiritual connection. It just goes to show you context is everything. This quote really nails it. Modern diagnostic manuals, like the DSM, are trying to walk this incredibly fine line. They need to identify a genuine dysfunction inside a person without accidentally penalizing them just because they don't fit neatly into society's boxes. It's a crucial distinction to make. So, we've covered distress, impairment, and cultural context. But there's another layer here we need to talk about: the words themselves. The language we use has evolved for very specific reasons, and the shift from calling something a mental illness to a disorder was a very deliberate, very thoughtful choice. If you look back, the term mental illness was actually a huge step forward. It was adopted to frame these conditions as real medical problems, not as moral failings or weaknesses. But today, mental disorder is the preferred term in clinical circles because it's more inclusive and, for a lot of people, carries less stigma. And this table breaks down the why perfectly. The term disorder does a much better job of including neurodevelopmental conditions like autism spectrum disorder, which aren't an illness you can catch or cure.
The word illness can also bring up some heavy, scary associations for people. Disorder helps acknowledge the incredibly complex mix of psychological, behavioral, and biological factors that are all at play.
So, as we start to wrap this up, it's so important to remember that this story doesn't have a final chapter. The definitions we've been talking about are not carved in stone. They are living documents, constantly changing as we learn more.
You can see that evolution right here on the screen. We've moved from just observing the outward symptoms, like distress or disability, to trying to understand the dysfunction in the underlying processes of the brain and mind. It shows a much more sophisticated, scientific understanding of what's really going on. And that's the bottom line. This is a field of science that is constantly advancing. As neuroscience and psychology push forward, our definitions and our entire understanding of mental disorders are going to keep getting more refined and hopefully a lot more helpful. And ultimately, we just have to remember this. These definitions, these criteria, all these labels, they're tools. They are absolutely essential for research and for treatment, but they can never, ever fully capture the complex, unique, and personal experience of the human being behind that diagnosis.
So, what's the big takeaway here? A feeling becomes a disorder when it causes significant distress and real-world impairment, and when it's understood within the right cultural context. But that definition is always a work in progress. Which leaves us with this final crucial question to think about. As our science gets better and more precise, how do we strike that perfect balance between the need for clear, objective criteria and a deep respect for the incredible diversity of human experience? It's a balance we have to keep striving for.